She thought it was just a jar of honey, a sweet treat, sitting quietly in my apiary, meant for family, neighbors, and the bees themselves. But Karen saw opportunity, not boundaries. She didn't knock, didn't ask, didn't hesitate. She simply took what wasn't hers. What she didn't know was that the apiary had its own guardians. Black bears, drawn to the scent, prowled silently in the woods nearby. And when she crossed the line, they noticed too. By the time she realized her mistake, she was facing a buzzing swarm and the unmistakable presence of nature's unexpected enforcers. Panic, disbelief, and a lesson she would never forget, all unfolding under the quiet eyes of the forest. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. The apiary sat at the edge of my property, a quiet stretch of land where bees hummed and flowers swayed in the breeze. It was a place of hard work, patience, and reward, a sanctuary where every hive had been carefully tended, every jar of honey collected with care. For years, the bees and I had maintained a rhythm together, a delicate balance of trust, observation, and care. Karen, however, had no respect for boundaries. She had always assumed that what belonged to others was fair game, her sense of entitlement overriding any thought of courtesy. It started with glances over the fence, casual comments about how sweet the honey looked, and minor complaints about how I managed the hives. At first, I ignored it, hoping she would leave well enough alone. But one morning, I discovered that she had gone further. A few jars of my finest honey had vanished, stolen without a word, without permission. The empty spots on the shelves were undeniable proof of her audacity. Neighbors had noticed the subtle tension building, whispers traveling along the fences about Karen's behavior, but no one dared confront her directly. She thrived on assumption that she could take what she wanted, that rules and property lines were suggestions rather than boundaries. I watched quietly from the porch, observing her approach the apiary once again. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world was hers to take, unaware that this time, her assumptions would be met with an unexpected countermeasure. Preparation was key, and the apiary had its guardians ready. Bees buzzed in careful patterns, their presence almost imperceptible but always attentive. The surrounding woods, home to black bears that roamed silently, provided a subtle, looming threat. I sipped my coffee, heart steady, noting every movement. Karen stepped closer to the hives, her eyes scanning for gaps, for opportunities. She didn't see the subtle traps I had set, not dangerous, just reminders that the line had been crossed. Each observation, each step added tension to the moment, turning the quiet apiary into a stage where patience, preparation, and accountability would meet audacity. The morning sun glinted off the jars, the bees hummed softly, and the forest watched quietly. This was no ordinary confrontation. Karen's theft had set the stage for a cinematic moment, where arrogance and entitlement would collide with consequence. The neighbors, hidden behind windows and fences, sensed the tension but had no idea how far the lesson would go. This wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, respect, and ensuring that repeated disregard would finally meet consequence. Karen had crossed the line, and now she would face the results. Safe, cinematic, and unforgettable, Karen moved closer to the hives, her eyes fixed on the jars of golden honey glinting in the morning sun. She stepped lightly, almost tiptoeing, as if expecting no one to notice her intrusion. But every movement was being observed, from the porch, from the fences, and, more importantly, by the quiet guardians of the apiary. The bees hummed louder, a rising chorus that seemed to signal the approaching reckoning. Karen didn't notice at first. She reached for a jar, the sweetness promising a reward she felt she deserved. Her confidence was palpable. She assumed she could take what she wanted without consequence. The subtle vibrations of the hives beneath her fingers went unnoticed, but they were a warning, an invisible line that had been crossed. From the woods beyond the apiary came a faint rustle. At first, it was indistinct, a background noise lost among the hum of the bees and the gentle swaying of the trees. But it grew louder, deliberate. Black bears, drawn to the scent of honey, had begun to stir. They moved cautiously, silently, yet with purpose, guided by instinct and curiosity. The forest had its watchers, and Karen had entered their domain uninvited. She lifted the jar and began walking toward her vehicle, unaware of the subtle tension building around her. The bees, sensing the disturbance, buzzed with increased intensity. The forest rustled again, shadows stretching between the trees. The bears were not aggressive, not yet, but their presence was undeniable. Karen's sense of control began to waver. She glanced over her shoulder, shivering as she noticed movement, dark shapes weaving through the underbrush. Her steps quickened. She carried the honey toward her truck, but every movement now felt heavier, as if the morning itself had turned against her. The bears drew closer, staying within the tree line, their dark eyes catching the glint of sunlight, tracking her every motion. The sound of the bees buzzed louder in her ears, an almost musical warning, a reminder that the hives were not hers to take lightly. Neighbors had begun to notice. Curtains twitched, and heads peeked cautiously over fences. Some whispered, others laughed quietly under their breath, realizing that Karen's usual arrogance was meeting something far bigger than herself. Nature, patient and unyielding, had taken notice. Karen's confidence was slipping. Her movements became hurried, her grip on the jar tightening. She glanced at the woods again, now noticing the shapes moving with purpose, the subtle crunch of leaves under the bear's paws. Panic began to bubble beneath her bravado. This wasn't a prank, a simple scolding, or a confrontation she could talk her way out of. This was instinct, consequence, and the undeniable result of her repeated disregard for boundaries. The bees swarmed subtly, their presence more intense now, circling with precision but never directly striking. Karen stumbled slightly, the jar wobbling in her hands. Her truck seemed farther away than it had been moments before, and the shadows in the trees stretched toward her like silent sentinels. The stage was set for a dramatic revelation, a moment where entitlement and arrogance would meet strategy, preparation, and the quiet power of nature. Every instinct in her body screamed to leave, but pride held her in place, a dangerous combination of hesitation and inevitability. The bears moved slightly closer, the bees buzzed in warning, and the neighbors watched, holding their breath. Karen's theft, her sense of entitlement, had led to this cinematic standoff, a confrontation she would never forget, where preparation and observation would collide with audacity in full view. And then, in that suspended moment, the first hint of panic fully took hold. The jars of honey wobbled, the bees surged slightly, and the bears stepped fully into view, curious, intelligent, and in command of their territory. Karen froze completely, realizing that she had overstepped, that her assumptions about control, entitlement, and impunity had been completely upended. Karen froze in the middle of the apiary, the jar of stolen honey trembling in her hands. The buzzing of the bees had intensified, a rising symphony that filled the morning air with an almost tangible tension. She could feel the vibrations under her fingertips, the subtle shift in the hives as if they were aware of her intrusion. Her confidence, once so absolute, had crumbled under the weight of anticipation she hadn't even realized was building. From the shadows of the surrounding woods, the black bears emerged cautiously. Not aggressive, but curious, they moved with quiet authority, their dark eyes reflecting intelligence and instinct. The scent of honey was unmistakable, and they approached deliberately, sniffing the air, paws brushing over fallen leaves. Karen's heart raced, her body stiffening as the realization began to dawn. She had crossed a line far beyond etiquette or entitlement. The first bear stopped a few yards away, sniffing the air, ears twitching. Karen shifted the jar nervously, her grip tightening. The bees swarmed above her, their wings beating a rhythmic warning, a natural orchestra signaling that the trespasser had been noticed. She took a hesitant step back, then another, but the bears mirrored her movement, matching her pace, yet never advancing too quickly. The dance of awareness and caution had begun. Neighbors had gathered at a safe distance, watching through fences and windows. Whispers turned into astonished murmurs as they realized the magnitude of the moment. Karen, who had flaunted her entitlement for months, was now facing consequences she could not control. Every step she took was mirrored by the instinctive guardians of the apiary, nature itself asserting boundaries where polite requests had failed. Karen's panic grew. The jar of honey wobbled in her hands, threatening to spill. The bears sniffed closer, their curiosity obvious, and the buzzing of the bees became almost deafening. She raised her arms, unsure whether to defend herself or flee, but the weight of her choices pinned her in place. Her mind raced. How had she underestimated the consequences of taking what wasn't hers? How had she assumed the world would bend to her will? A sharp rustle in the bushes drew her gaze, and she realized the other bears were beginning to circle. Not threatening, not violent, but fully aware, fully present, and fully capable of asserting their dominion over the hives she had attempted to exploit. The bees surged, buzzing in an almost choreographed rhythm, a living warning that she was out of her depth. Her breaths came in quick, shallow bursts. The neighbors watched in awe, some holding their hands to their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The scene was cinematic, nature, order, and consequence converging in a single, unforgettable tableau. Karen's theft, her arrogance, her assumption of control, all collided with the careful preparation of the apiary, the instinctive intelligence of the bears, and the unwavering vigilance of the bees. Karen finally dropped the jar, the honey splashing onto the ground in a sticky, golden pool. The bees buzzed around it, circling like sentinels, while the bears sniffed cautiously but didn't advance further. She stumbled back, eyes wide, chest heaving, realizing that the lesson had been delivered without a single aggressive act. Nature itself had ensured accountability. She stepped away slowly, finally understanding the stakes of her actions. The neighbors, still observing, nodded quietly. The lesson extended beyond Karen. It was a reminder that boundaries exist, that entitlement has limits, and that repeated disregard can be met with consequences far more precise than confrontation. The bears eventually retreated to the shadows of the woods, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the apiary, humbled, shaken, and thoroughly aware that she had crossed a line she could not undo. The buzzing of the bees calmed slightly, returning to their rhythmic work, as if acknowledging that order had been restored. Karen's face drained of color. Her posture, once confident, was now tentative. She had learned, in the most cinematic and unforgettable way possible, that respect and boundaries are non-negotiable, and that crossing them, even with arrogance, can bring consequences far beyond human expectation. And as the morning sun cast long shadows across the apiary, the lesson lingered in the air. Patience, preparation, and natural guardianship could enforce accountability in ways that words never could. Karen's audacity had met a force she could not control, and in that collision, cinematic clarity was achieved. Karen stood in stunned silence, honey spilled at her feet, the bees settling back into their hives, and the black bears retreating into the forest. The lesson was clear: boundaries exist, and repeated disregard has consequences. Neighbors whispered in awe, realizing that entitlement could meet accountability in unexpected ways. The apiary returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of that morning lingered, a reminder that patience, preparation, and respect for nature and others' property are non-negotiable. Karen's arrogance had collided with consequence, leaving a story that would be remembered long after the honey was gone.